Warning, this episode contains brain food that will lead to improved emotional and social intelligence. Thanks for tuning in to Harvesting Happiness today for a healthy serving of consciously prepared brain food. This is Lisa Cypers-Kamen, your host. For more than 13 years, I've been handcrafting these sound ideas for better well-being. Each week, I love spotlighting diverse thinkers and doers who are contemporary trendsetters and change agents, devoting their lives to creating a better world in which to live. I invite you to listen up and change the way you think about human happiness. Our award-winning content is fresh, optimistic, and purpose-driven media that promotes well-being from the inside out. Alrighty then, let's dive in. This episode offers psychosocial education designed to inspire and motivate our listeners. The information provided does not constitute a therapeutic relationship nor a substitute for professional mental health care. If you are experiencing a mental health crisis, call 911, go to your nearest emergency room, or for listeners in the United States, text 988 for the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining me on today's show, where we will be examining Darwinian cultural evolution, the dumbing down of humanity, and critical blindness. My guest today is Dr. Steije Hofhuis. Dr. Steije Hofhuis is a lecturer in cultural history at the Department of History and Art History at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. His fields of interest include Darwinian theory of evolution, early modern witch persecutions, theory of history, and the history of migration and integration. In 2016, Steije started his part-time PhD research funded by the Stichting Professor van Winter Fonds. Did I say that right?
Oh, yes, I'm impressed by your Dutch pronunciation.
Which in 2022 resulted in the dissertation named Qualitative Darwinism, an Evolutionary History of Witch Hunting. Steije completed his research master's in history at the University of Amsterdam in 2011, and from 2013 through 2016, he worked as a junior lecturer at the Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies of the same university. Welcome, Steije. Thanks for joining me on the show today. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, I can imagine. Many people find witch persecutions a very exciting topic.
Oh, it's a very exciting topic, specifically as to how it relates to contemporary society and the polarization that has gone on, not just in the United States, but around the world.
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah, because the peak of witch hunting occurred in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. And this was also a period of very strong polarization between Catholics and Calvinists, Lutherans. So in some ways, it does look familiar.
So when we talk about the definition of a witch going back to the 1600s, let's talk a little bit about who these people were.
It could be highly diverse, but the people who were most often suspected of witchcraft were people who had reputations for maleficent magic within their local communities. So within little towns, within little villages, there were gossips about specific persons. So for instance, there were rumors that they had harmed livestock, that they had made children ill. And those rumors could be going on for a long time. But at some point, communities often became too angry with what they perceived as their local witches. And then they would go to the authorities. And if the authorities decided to start a witch trial, then things really got going.
So there was no real fact involved. It was perception?
It was mostly perception, yeah, and vague indications. Like, for instance, that woman appeared at that place, and shortly thereafter, a cow fell ill. Or there was a hailstorm, and what was she doing at that moment in time? Or wasn't she talking to people while nobody was at her place? So perhaps she was talking to demons. It was really rumors like this that could start the whole thing going.
So it wasn't even that these people were practicing some form of mysticism or spiritual practice that was not considered conventional. It was purely speculation.
Not necessarily. Sometimes it may have happened that people also themselves believed that they had magical powers, so that also stimulated their reputation. And it's not unthinkable that some people also try to use magic in harmful ways. But in many cases, it was mostly speculation.
Unbelievable. And it's interesting how those times are now present once again, right? The history repeats itself. The cycle repeats itself because somebody can just think or say something about another person or another group or a state of affairs. And they have then the power to infect a group or an organization through social media, through the media, even the mainstream media, right?
Yeah, it can be very harmful, and it can be very difficult to defend yourself against such fake allegations. Yeah, so some of the mechanisms are quite universal.
So in your studies and in your relating Darwinian cultural evolution to these witch trials, talk a little bit about the interplay between society and culture and what Darwin had to say.
Well, as a student, I became fascinated by the idea of cultural viruses, or mindbugs, it's sometimes also called. So the idea is that forms of culture can evolve in a Darwinian way, like a virus. So they constantly adapt to their environment, spread through people, but potentially they also spread in very harmful ways. So the people who transmit it suffer the consequences of the cultural phenomenon. And what I found very fascinating is that these cultural viruses are not necessarily shrewdly designed by people. It may be a cultural Darwinian process. So all sorts of cultural variants appear, most of them die out, and only the ones that are best adapted for survival within their particular environment are the ones that survive. So culture can adapt like a virus, and it may look as if it was intelligently designed. I mean, if you take the coronavirus, it seems very intelligently designed to spread. Right. And to hijack us and to evade our immune systems. But it wasn't designed. It's just all sorts of variations, and some of them just make it to the next generation. Yeah, and I've looked at the witch hunting phenomenon, this historical phenomenon, from that angle. I looked at it as a cultural virus.
And we're not just talking about the Netherlands, right? You can go to other parts of the world as time has passed. Going to the US and the Salem witch trials is another example, right?
Yes, very much so. Yeah, and I've especially looked at witch persecutions in Germany, because Switzerland and Germany, Eastern France, that was really the worst region. Yeah, and especially from around 1550 to 1630, it grew enormously. So this is something that I've looked at in particular. So what happened that made witch hunting so much bigger and so much worse in this particular time period?
Is it fear? Well, obviously, there's always fear at the root of these things, right? Because the other is not like me, therefore they're the enemy kind of thing, and we need to get rid of them. But also, if you look at what's going on with the availability, I don't know, I'm just throwing it out there, of food, right? Of supplies, of territory, of governance. I would think that all of these apply to this us versus them escalation.
Oh, yes, very much so. Yeah, many historians assume that people were genuinely afraid of witchcraft. So the idea was that some people allied themselves with the devil, and the devil gave these people magical powers. And with these powers, they harmed people within their own communities. Mm-hmm. And this idea already existed in the 15th century. But from 1550 onwards, there was the Little Ice Age. So there were very strange weather conditions, less economic resources, there was overpopulation. So people became very moody, and became interested to know, like, what's happening here? Why these sudden frosts in late spring? So people became vulnerable to the idea that there were internal enemies, people within their own communities who had allied themselves with the devil and who were doing things like killing livestock or causing hailstorms. Yeah, so this idea grew, and increasingly people also started to believe that it was a big conspiracy. So these alleged witches, they met each other in the middle of the night at so-called witches' Sabbaths, and there they met the devil. They also had sex with the devil and with demons.
Wow.
So really spooky events. Yeah, so it was a huge conspiracy, and the end of times was near. So they thought that the devil was also doing everything he could to lure people into evil and to cause as much harm as he could. So they thought they were living in epic times. And it was a life or death struggle against this conspiracy.
And, you know, it's reminiscent of what we hear today, right? In many countries, the political polarization is saying the very same thing, right? That it's purely speculative to inject fear into society and make people believe that if they don't believe like them, that it will be the end of days. That if we don't share the same concern, the same worry for the same things, which is fear of the unknown, right? It's trying to explain the unknowable.
Yeah, there were inexplicable events,
yes.
like strange weather conditions that people were really not used to. And it did make sense within their particular framework that it was a diabolical conspiracy that was behind it.
And I'm going to go out on a limb with what I'm about to say, and people might cringe after I say it. But when we think about religion helps create organization and explain the unknowable, right? Mm-hmm. So in a certain sense, this is an alternative explanation that lays blame on the other and tells society that if you don't believe like we do, we're going to persecute you.
Yeah, because the more traditional Christian explanation for unusual misfortune was that it was a divine punishment.
From God.
Yes. But this conviction increasingly gave way to the conviction that it was indeed a divine punishment, but this punishment happened through the devil who used witches. So you did have to persecute people within your own community, because if you wouldn't persecute the witches, they would keep doing what they were doing, namely causing a lot of harm. And also God would punish you, because God would look very critically. I mean, there were communities who destroyed the Bible, who were spitting on the cross. So this was extremely offensive. So God would also judge people how they would respond to this diabolical conspiracy within their own communities. So that made it very urgent. But at the same time, there were also many Christians who didn't buy it, who said that this was an illusion, and that witch hunting was a very, very bad thing that was shedding a lot of innocent blood.
And who are these people? Are these the ones that were inoculated against the nonsense, right? They were critical thinkers. They examined evidence. And if there was no evidence to prove contrary, logic ruled.
Yeah. So there were always people who criticized it at all levels of society. So that is also why at many places there were hardly or no witch persecutions. Yeah, and they, as you say, they examined the evidence. So, for instance, what they criticized was that persecutors used torture to find out who the witches were. Because, I mean, nobody or hardly anyone would say that they were a witch voluntarily. So when there were a lot of suspicions within communities against specific persons, the interrogators in some cases decided to use torture to make people confess, and also to make them tell them who the other witches were. So a key question was, who have you seen at the witches' Sabbath? And through torture, of course, people often started to mention names. I mean, I would probably do the same thing. Yeah, so then these people were also tortured. Sometimes they also mentioned names. So that's how this whole thing could get out of hand completely. And in extreme cases, hundreds of people were killed during witch hunts that created big chains of accusations. Yeah, and fortunately, at the time, there were already many people who said, like, this is nonsense. You get all sorts of false confessions.
Of course. And we say that today, right? Even in terms of having torture as part of interrogation policy, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Because by nature, we want the pain and suffering to stop. So we'll do whatever it takes to get it to stop.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
We are going to need to take a break. And when we come back, we will get back to the fantastic conversation with Dr. Steije Hofhuis to learn more about his work. I'm going to give quite a unique website. You can go to the website www.uu.nl/staff/STHOFHUIS. On Twitter, you can find Steije Hofhuis at HOFHUIS So it's a unique pronunciation, Steije Hofhuis. And on LinkedIn, you can find him at the same, Steije Hofhuis, and that's STEIJEHOFHUIS. Here comes the pause. We'll be right back. Research tells us that happiness is good for our health. Happy people live longer, are more productive, and make better partners, parents, and professionals. Want more sound ideas for better well-being? Check out our new bonus edition content, More Mental Fitness by Harvesting Happiness, available exclusively on Medium and Substack. One thing I know for certain, happiness waits for no one, and at times we all need a little support. To learn more about lifestyle management and mental fitness consulting services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. And we're back with the examination of Darwinian cultural evolution, the dumbing down of humanity, and critical blindness. Let's get back to the conversation with my guest, Dr. Steije Hofhuis. We're talking about the history of witch hunts, which is something that Steije studies, and it relates back to mind bugs and critical thinking and how we can inoculate ourselves against misinformation. And I guess most importantly, I think what your work ties into the present reality is how history repeats itself, how we as humans, while we've evolved, there are parts of us that have not changed that much in hundreds of years.
No, and some of the mechanisms behind witch hunting are quite universal, and you see similar things happen today.
It's a nefarious marketing campaign.
Well, that's one of the things I've been looking at, because many past historians thought that witch hunting was like a shrewd design by people involved. So, for instance, Catholic inquisitors or upcoming elites allegedly used the witch hunts for particular purposes, like oppressing women, getting more power, destroying traditional peasant culture. But what I found very fascinating about this phenomenon is that many historians actually didn't find sort of the designing agents behind it. So there weren't really people involved who shrewdly created it and systematically used witch hunts for a hidden purpose. It was more haphazard. So witch hunting disappeared for a while, then suddenly it erupted elsewhere and then disappeared again. And many historians have compared it to epidemic diseases or viruses. So there doesn't seem to be a shrewd agent or a systematic institution behind it. It's quite haphazard. And this is why I find this Darwinian perspective very fascinating, because it assumes that it doesn't have to be evil people behind it. So the people who persecuted witches had a sort of a mind bug in their minds, a cultural concept that was very ingeniously adapted to make them believe in witchcraft and to make them hunt witches. So it was like a cultural virus that had entered their minds and made them do all sorts of terrible things that in many cases harmed their own communities and even the people themselves who persecuted witches, because there are quite some examples of people who persecuted witches and who then ended up at some point at the stake themselves.
Wow. So what I think I'm hearing you say is it's an organism, right? It's organic, that this happens, then it snowballs and escalates, and the whole the driving force behind it is to give explanation to something that has no explanation. So if this is happening, it must be that.
Yeah. So people had all sorts of fears, and they were confronted with inexplicable events. And this cultural concept became really well adapted to all those fears. So it made people terribly afraid. And it also seemed to offer certain explanations. And for instance, one of the key ideas behind witch hunting was that the devil tried to seduce people into witchcraft, but that women were particularly vulnerable. So he also seduced quite a lot of men. Around 20 to 25% of the people who were killed as alleged witches were men. But women were far more vulnerable. So there were all sorts of ideas at the time about women being more irrational. They had more sexual lust. They were more earthly. So that made them an easy prey for the devil. So he seduced them by having sex with them and to make them abjure God. So that, to people at the time, was the key explanation for why women were more often witches. So this idea of women having sex with the devil, that to many people at the time was absolutely outrageous. So it made them very afraid and very angry. It really made them feel like this is an extreme crime that we must fight.
Yeah. And I also wonder if we think about women in their inherent power and ability to communicate, because we tend to be the thinker, the deep thinkers and the feelers about things going on around us. If there was not fear of those qualities, those characteristics, just basic, like, oh, this is a threat. This is a threat to the status quo.
Yeah. Yeah, but interestingly, women also quite often accused each other of witchcraft.
Mm-hmm. What's that about?
It often started with these rumors, and it could be men who accused people within their own communities of witchcraft, in most cases women, but it could also be women who contributed to those rumors and accused each other. So often there were other conflicts going on, and people were wondering, like, what kind of person in my own community would be susceptible to witchcraft? And then often they first thought of other individuals that they already disliked for other reasons. So they thought, well, that's really a bad person. So that's really the kind of person that would ally him or herself with the devil. So that the term bad people and witches were often used interchangeably.
This is so fascinating, because for me, what I keep hearing is the fear of the unknown, looking outside of oneself to try and lay blame for an explanation that may or may not have one, right? Bad weather,
Nicely.
In the 1500s or the 1600s, well, it's probably just bad weather, right?
Yeah. There was not, a little ice age was going on. That's how we look at it now.
Yeah.
But people at the time, of course, had no clue about that. And they were simply confronted with something very harmful that they could not explain.
Right.
And
no industrial revolution.
Merely divine punishment became more unbearable. They really wanted something else to work with. Yeah, so then this idea that it is internal enemies became appealing.
So because we as humans yearn to apply logic to explain things, the irony of all of this is that as society, we tend to want to connect with some very quirky things or quirky explanations to define the undefinable. And this is probably, your research leads you to this, right? That the human condition will create magical thinking in order to define something, because it needs a definition in order to organize itself, we as society.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and what I looked at in particular is how this cultural phenomena exploited that.
Yeah.
So what I noticed is that these witchcraft beliefs constantly adapted in new ways to create bigger and more witch persecutions. So something very spooky, for instance, was that from around 1580, 1590, people increasingly started to believe that children could also be witches. So they thought that very often the witch parents took their children to the witches' Sabbath. So people became very careful to listen to what children had to say about witchcraft. But children often provided all sorts of imaginative testimonies. They often didn't understand the consequences of what they were saying. So, for instance, in the city of Bamberg in southern Germany, there was a failed harvest because of a sudden frost late May. And there were a lot of rumors about witchcraft. And then a little boy, Hans Moorhaupt, talked to people about this and said that he flew with his mother and the maid out of a window from their place to a witch's sabbath in a nearby forest. Yeah, and these confessions, yeah, which of course were based on the fantasies from a small boy, eventually led to the killing of hundreds of people, including this boy himself and much of his family.
Wow.
So the ideas about witchcraft adapted in new ways that stimulated more witch persecutions, because in the late phase, many persecutions started with children making all sorts of accusations.
You know, it's interesting. If you look at contemporary society in politics, and you hear from all different sides, this is a witch hunt, that is a witch hunt, right? It is the same thing, pointing the finger at the other to explain some situation in a persecutory fashion.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and usually connecting it to some sort of huge evil.
Yeah, the dark forces.
Yeah. Yeah.
The deep
state.
And
of course, you see differences. So at the time, the idea of the devil allying himself with women was utterly outrageous. And now, for instance, in conspiracy theories, you see that certain politicians of the other side are pedophiles. So that's really adapted to some of the ultimate fears of today's society, or something that today makes us extremely angry. Whereas at the time, it was different concepts, but some of the mechanisms are quite similar. So these cultural concepts adapt to what people in a specific society find most outrageous.
And then it becomes, I'm going to do the air quotes, right? The fittest explanation for a society at that time, right? To use this Darwinian, theory.
Because at the time, pedophilia was not a big issue, so it didn't adapt into that direction.
Yeah.
But today it is. So conspiracy theories today very much make that a major issue.
This is a lot. It's a lot to swallow, and we're nearly out of time. And I want to touch upon the antidote, how we inoculate ourselves against this nonsense as good thinkers. We are going to continue our conversation in the special content over on Substack. But for this episode, let's talk a little bit about how we can inoculate ourselves. What is the antidote? How do we manage in society so we don't create our own witch hunt in our own communities?
I think one of the most important things is to be very careful about standards of proof. So what is really proof something? Because in the age of the witch hunts, there were all sorts of regulations, for instance, against torture, because people already understood that torture is, to some extent, an unreliable instrument. But the proponents of witch hunting said, this is a crimen acceptum, a crime that is so very terrible that the normal standards of proof, yet we can just get rid of them. Because this is holy, we can have faith that God will not let innocent people die, so we can just move onward. And if people criticized witch hunting, they immediately saw that as an indication for witchcraft. So people who criticized witch hunting were often then burned as witches themselves. So this is something that we should always be very careful about. So always give room to counter voices and people who really question your evidence. And you shouldn't say, what we're doing is too holy, you can't criticize it.
Yeah,
I think that's one of the best ways of protecting ourselves against such mind viruses.
And I also think that questioning governance is important. Being able to use critical thinking, just because somebody is elected to office does not necessarily mean that they're sacred and should be there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because there are lots of forces at work in terms of how elections go.
Yeah, and it's also very important to ask yourself, like, what counter evidence would make me question my own conviction? So, for instance, in the case of the witch hunts, if people saw the torture machines and immediately confessed being a witch, that was seen as confirmation. Like,
Oh,
okay,
right.
yeah, they're witches. But there were also people who endured endless torture. There was, for instance, one woman in Germany who was tortured for 1.5 years, but she still refused to confess. But to the persecutors, that was also proof, because that was unnatural. There had to be demons involved who helped her endure the torture. So whatever happened, the witch persecutors always saw confirmation that they were on the right track. So I
Wow.
think this is also a very important question that we must ask ourselves. Like, what evidence would make us question our own convictions?
A big question, a very big question. We're going to continue more of this conversation over on the special content. Steije, I want to talk a lot more with you about this, but this episode is over. So to learn more about Steije Hofhuis's work, please go to the website at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. And let me spell that out. It's www.uu.nl/staff, and it's STHOFHUIS. Dr. Steije Hofhuis is spelled in a unique way. You can find him on Twitter at Hofhuis Steije, and that's HOFHUIS and on LinkedIn, the same spelling, but in reverse, Steije Hofhuis. Thank you so much for opening our eyes to history, to politics, to mind bugs, to ways that we can question everything around us in a positive way and look for proof in a constructive way. Jump on over to Substack to learn more. Thanks for joining us on Harvesting Happiness today. This is Lisa Cypers-Kamen on behalf of my guest, Dr. Steije Hofhuis, wishing you kind thoughts, kinder words, and the kindest of actions. Until next time, remember, happiness is an inside job. Happiness is your inside job. Please go out and rock your day and remember to be kind to one another. Want to take a deeper dive into sound ideas for better well-being? Check out our new bonus edition content, More Mental Fitness by Harvesting Happiness, available exclusively on Medium and Substack. Keep harvesting your own happiness anytime, anywhere from the comfort of wherever you are. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes from wherever you get your podcasts. Connect with and follow us on most social media channels. To learn more about lifestyle management and mental fitness consulting services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. Harvesting Happiness and More Mental Fitness are produced by me, Lisa Cypers-Kamen, Andrea Mengele, Robin Boyd, Andrea Daly, and the awesome team at Podfly Productions, including Eric Begay, Kimberly Beck, and Alec Guess, in collaboration with TogiNet Radio, KBUU, RadioMalibu.net, and is available on PRX, the Public Radio Exchange.